Before the Syrian refugee crisis hit such serious levels, the European Union was already feeling tremors from an economic standpoint. Can the EU survive both of these destabilizers? I'm joined by former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Tony Blair. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Can the EU survive both of these 1-2 punches?
Well, it can survive, but it's a big challenge because on the migration issue, there's an issue of numbers. You know, how many people can Europe absorb? But there's also an issue of security. Can we be sure exactly who is coming in? So those two issues combined make it a very, very tough political challenge.
Well, let me push you on that. The open border situation that we have right now seems to be at risk precisely because of that. We saw what happened in Paris. Certain movements of migrants can be traced to some of the terrorists. Surely we all understand how people on the ground feel who are law-abiding citizens.
Yeah, well, this is the big challenge. So when it comes to the migrants and genuine refugees, I think there is a genuine desire to be generous, even though people worry about the numbers since the numbers are very large. But I think it is the security issue that is troubling people. So in my view, we've got to make sure in Europe that we've got a policy that is dealing with the security question as well as the migration question.
You've talked about actually having an EU army. Does that come from having to stabilize the region, and would that supplant NATO forces?
No, I mean, I don't actually advocate an EU army. What I think is important is that Europe pools its force capabilities in a more effective way. So, for example, we're talking about a migration crisis that's coming out of the crisis in Syria. If we don't solve the crisis in Syria, we're not going to solve the migration problem. Likewise, we face the same potential problem from Libya. So if you need, as part of solving these crises, to exercise some force capability, then Europe, in my view, has got to up its game in defence terms. So I don't mean that we amalgamate all the armed forces in one big EU army. That would never work. But how we make sure, particularly when we're working alongside the US, that Europe is stepping up with its own responsibilities, that's, I think, the challenge.
You have said that the conversation about European Union survival is motivated by politics, but it's driven by economics. Why is that a bad thing, Prime Minister? Because I look at what's going on, and you have some nations who adhere very stringently, like Germany, to the rules, and then you have others that have broken all the rules, talking about Greece and some of the so-called pigs nations. It's not a very delicate term, but they've broken the rules and they haven't been financially stable.
Well, I think the problem really arises from the single currency, where you put a whole lot of economies together at different stages of development. And so really what has to happen now is that these economies are going to have to undergo a process of deep structural reform. And I think the big challenge for the Eurozone, obviously the UK is not in the single currency, but the challenge for the Eurozone is, how do you make sure you take the structural reforms on board that allow you then to make the single currency work? Because if Germany continues to operate as an economy in a different way from the other economies to which it's joined, then that's when you get the tensions.
Either way, global power seems to be shifting east. We're talking about China, certainly. Can the UK and the US, former sort of superpowers, and still we hope, can they retain that status?
I think we can, provided we're very clear about what we stand for. We make sure that we remain economically strong. And this is why the European crisis needs sorting out, because it's really the US and Europe that need to stand together. And China is going to be, one of the great powers, if not by the end of this century, the big power in the world. And we need China to develop and evolve economically, politically, in a way that's benign for the world. Now, I think there's a real possibility of that, but we need to make sure it happens.
Let me go back to the migrant crisis, because it's driving a lot of political discussion. Number one, can the EU survive this influx of Syrian and other refugees?
Well, it can survive it, but it's going to be a big challenge. And if you did get terrorist activity coming in on the back of it, it would be a huge political problem. So my view, very simply, again, is that you've got to go to the origins of it, which is the Syria crisis, and we have to have a policy that allows us to make progress there and resolve that situation, because if we don't, we'll continue to get these flows of migrants. And secondly, we need to make sure that whatever policies we have on migration, we have a strong security position, because it's security that in the end will be really troubling people.
Yeah, security costs money, but the political conversation has been driven by this. As we look at both the United States and European nations, it seems like extremist politics from the right and from the left really seem to be rising. Look, in the United States, you have Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders. In the the European Union, you've got other nations that really have very strong voices. Are we seeing the death of centrist politics?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think no, but I think if the centre's not muscular, then the extremes gain. And that's why centrist politics should not be a sort of soggy compromise between left and right. It's got to have a series of tough policies that meet the concerns and anxieties of people, but do so in a way that's sensible. Because a lot of the populism left and right, it's very good at playing to people's anger, but it doesn't actually provide answers. And, in the end, it's answers that create the right type of future for our countries. But you see this in the US, you see it in the UK, you see it all over. The only thing I feel in the end is that when you look at the election results, the broad public, who in the end decide the result in a democracy, I still think that they are located more in the centre than people realise.
I have to ask you what you made of the British Parliament debating whether to ban Donald Trump from entering the country. You had you're laughing. There was a petition of more than 500,000 people saying keep him out because of his stance on Muslims.
Right, man, you can get petitions of 500,000 people on virtually anything nowadays. No, look, I think it's however much I may disagree with what he says, I don't think that would be a sensible course of action to take. So, in any event, let me tell you, we're all watching your election in the US with a lot of interest. I'd say also a little bit of anxiety, but but it certainly makes for interesting viewing.
Certainly does. Thank you so much, Mr. Prime Minister. Always a pleasure.
All the best.
Tony
Thanks.
Blair.